Looking really at Jesus's demonstrable cleverness today, and what we're going to be sharing is quite similar to things if you saw in the plenary sessions last year. Also, there was some so-called masterclass for the forum a couple of years before, and a lot of it will come out in a book in October with Crossway called The Surprising Genius of Jesus, hence the title of the seminar. And I really want us to home in on Jesus's longest parable, which is in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through to 32, which I count to be 388 words. You have a 5-word introduction, and then we go into the parable where 62% is about the younger son and 38% about the older son. We're told in Luke's gospel about the audience. It's 2 groups of 2. The tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to hear Jesus. Notice this is Luke's brilliant style, where they actually draw near. The people you'd think would be far away are drawing near. And then we have the Pharisees and the scribes grumbling, which of course is what Israel does in the desert. So those who are meant to be bad are coming close to Jesus. Those who are meant to be all good are grumbling. And their complaint is this man receives sinners and eat with them. So we have our 2 groups of 2, tax collectors interested in selling their souls to collect money for the Romans, and sinners interested in sin. So to get to be called a sinner, I guess you have to be quite a habitual, characteristic sinner. It's part of your identity, if you like. And a Pharisee is part of their identity is their separateness from sin. So that, again, these sort of identity wars in terms of different groups we've got here. Pharisees, you expect to study the scripture well, and scribes study scripture particularly well. Scribes do other jobs, like they might perform the job of a notary. They might do some official documents, buying and selling of fields and so on. But one of the very big things that scribes do in a Jewish context, first century Palestine, is they copy out the scriptures, particularly the first 5 books of the scriptures. And one of the things we can see that these scribes do is they actually count words and count letters. In fact, the word scribe in Hebrew, sofer, is also related to the word count. And they need to count letters in order to distinguish similar but not identical phrases, so they don't copy one in place of the other. To this group, Luke reports that Jesus told 3 stories, although he just calls them one parable. The first one is of 100 sheep, and the sheep is lost going away. It is framed as a question. Then we have a story of 1 coin lost, but this coin is not lost going away. The coin is lost at home, again phrased as a question. Then we have a story of 2 sons, one lost going away and the other lost at home, although it's not said that he's lost, because Jesus often, and again part of his genius, is not making everything explicit. So I think when you feel you need to make everything explicit, it's often very boring, and you'll find that those who maintain more interest as storytellers leave things for you to work out. So in many ways, these 2 stories are a perfect introduction to the story that we have at the end. And this story is not framed as a question. We go up from 1% lost to 10% lost, and arguably the next percentage we might want is 100% lost. The story ends without an ending because you don't know how the older brother responds, but you know how Sudoku works, and you have enough information to fill in the missing numbers. So we know that if there's joy over discovering the sheep, finding the sheep that went away from home, and there's joy over finding the coin that was at home, and there's joy over finding the lost son when he comes back, what will the reaction be if that other older brother responds well to his father? There will of course be joy. But that ending is missed out in order to give maximum rhetorical punch to the impact of this story, the challenge of this story, to those who would align with the older brother. So this is all very clever. Jesus then starts this story. There was a man who had 2 sons. That is a trigger, because that sets off in your mind thoughts of other people who might have 2 sons. If you think in terms of the Bible, then famously Adam had 2 sons. Yes, he had some more sons later, but it's pretty prominent he has 2 sons, and the other ones just come later. Then there's Abraham, he has 2 sons. Yes, there are more, but they come along later. And then Isaac, he has 2 and only 2 sons. So it can trigger some of these sorts of stories. And then he begins, the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me." And he divided his property between them. The absolutely vital pronoun there, them, not just gave it to him, he divides it. What country does this story take place in? We don't know. It's a story. So let's imagine if it takes place in a Jewish country, then, of course, Jewish law would be the older brother gets more. In fact, in most countries, like we think about European history, if there was the miller had the 3 sons, the oldest son gets the mill. This is the way it works. If this is a farm, you just don't divide the farm into ever smaller lots. So you can assume that the older brother has done very well out of this. He should really be perpetually grateful to his younger brother because he gets his inheritance early, because his brother did the dirty work of asking the difficult question from dad. So he should be incredibly happy. Dear little brother, if ever you need a favor, I'm just so glad that you have enabled me to become so much richer. But of course, that's not quite how the story goes. From the legal side, then, it would seem that the younger brother probably goes off with the movable property. But again, Jesus, as a good storyteller, this is only a story that takes less than 3 minutes to tell, and this is his longest story, leaves so much unsaid. Just to give you another example, in Luke 18, where you have the Pharisee and the tax collector, what you find is it doesn't feel the need to fill in every detail about it. In terms of the parallel, you can talk about the eyes of one of them and not about the other, and that will imply the opposite, if you see, for the other. This is the sort of way Jesus takes shortcuts in telling stories, and it's very, very powerful. We read that the son wastes his property. He moves away and wastes his property. Well, think about this. If we have 19th century novels inspired by the prodigal son, this is the bit that takes up the whole central section of the book. It's the really big section. If we have a film inspired by the story of the prodigal son, it's the big part of the film, but for Jesus, it's one word, which is an amazing thing, because, of course, you're never better off after hearing a story of sin. Sometimes you need to hear a story of sin so you can sympathize with a friend, but you're never better off. It's not actually inherently entertaining, and sin's actually very boring. And if you tell stories of sin too much, the danger is you're glamorizing it. And the most powerful thing to do with this sin is to leave it in your imagination, because then it's able to connect with all sorts of circumstances, not just one particular sort of sinful circumstance. So there we read that this son wastes his property with riotous living. And of course, that word waste is powerful because it's in the immediately adjacent story. The following story, Luke chapter 16, is a story of a rich man who had a manager. Charges are brought against him that this man was wasting his possessions. So we have 2 stories about people who waste money told in the audience of the Pharisees, who hate the fact that their money is being wasted by being taxed by the Romans. Okay? And people can get quite upset about the thought of the government taking taxes and then wasting money. Okay? In most countries, people get really self-righteous about this. Well, think about it. If you're a Pharisee having to give some of your hard-earned wealth to the Roman Empire, oh, please, can I pay the Romans so they can oppress me? No, that's not really a good investment. So you're feeling your money's being wasted. This is not a good investment. Yes, they build roads, but, you'd like to think you could do that yourself. So Jesus tells this story in a very clever way. And then we see that this younger son gets into such a bad situation that he ends up feeding pigs. Now, when people retell this story, there's been a little bit of experiment. I think it was with a group from St. Petersburg and somewhere in America, where someone had two different groups telling this story, and those who had been more in Russia had been more closely connected with famine more recently remembered that there was a famine in the story, and the Americans generally didn't. And I think that's a really interesting part. Why would you even bother having the famine in the story? Why would you bother telling that it's not just that the younger son made bad choices, a series of bad choices, but that when he had spent everything, he was unlucky enough to have chosen the one land where there was a famine? That's what it says. In that particular land, there was a famine. Not there was a famine in every land. So he's not just prodigal and wasteful, he's that and unlucky. And that makes a real difference about how we feel in relation to him, because often we portray him as just the sinful son. The older brother sees him as just my sinful little brother, but doesn't see he's sinful and unlucky. And often when people are in bad circumstances, there's a combination of their own bad decisions plus their bad luck. And you understand, I'm not using luck in a theological term, I'm using it in an experience way. And so what we find is that it says he began to be in need. That is a brilliant part of the story, just to say he began to, because what that does is it draws out the need. Just as it says when they began to celebrate, it says this is something that's going to go on for a long time. So the exact word choice, every single word in this parable is very important, and that's pretty good evidence the parable doesn't come from committee, and I think we can make a compelling case it goes back to Jesus. So that's the part about the famine. Notice then the word choice where it says that at this point he then hired himself out, not that he got any money, but he gave himself away freely to a citizen. Now that is a very strong term, because in a sense it automatically highlights the fact that he is in a strange country and he is not a citizen. He is excluded. So it's a brilliant vocabulary choice of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed pigs. Began to celebrate, we've looked at, and then we've got that bit in the story where Jesus says the older brother was in the field. But notice he does not tell you what he was doing in the field. But given that Jesus can be explicit and implicit, what are we most likely to deduce that he was doing in the field? He was working. He was working late. In fact, he's working late when other people are already at a party, and you're wondering why he hasn't yet been invited to the party or heard about the party, but he's such a hard-working person. You know, parties aren't really the thing he's going to go for. Then we have this amazing piece where you have a missing word. The older brother talks to the father, and his first word to the father is, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you." Now, with the younger son, every time he's addressed his father, and that's been 3 occasions, once in his mind, in the middle of the story, once when he returns, and once at the beginning of the story. Each time he calls him father. That's the very first word from his mouth. Here you have the missing word. And the missing word tells you a lot. It tells you that this older brother is up close physically, but he is emotionally distant. The other brother, the younger brother, is physically distant and emotionally close. And then you see this amazing statement where this older brother says, "All these years I've served you, literally slaved for you. I never disobeyed your command," as if he's treating his dad as if he's just giving out orders, right? "And yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends." Well, hang on. He owns the farm. The older brother owns the farm. So for him to say, "I've been vegetarian all these years, you never gave me a goat," it's not very plausible. But again, Jesus doesn't need to spell it out too much. He leaves some work for the audience to do. "You never gave me a young goat." Of course, the celebration is a fatted calf, 400 to 500 portions of meat. Young goat, much, much smaller. But he says, "You never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends." Now, if you go through the stories, you're reading about celebration after celebration. The shepherd celebrates. The woman who finds the coin celebrates. The father, when his younger son returns, celebrates. It's all about celebration. But what celebration does this man want? He wants a celebration with his friends and implicitly not with his father. He owns the farm. He could have his friends round any time for some farm meat. That's what you can do if you own a farm. But somehow, eating meat with his father doesn't satisfy him. He wants to eat meat with his friends away from his father in this miserable little celebration about a young goat, rather than the big celebration with his father and his brother and the fatted calf. It's all very powerful. And we've talked already about the missing ending. Now, one of the things that I think Jesus does in his stories is he also stretches the scribes. That is, he has this dual audience, people you would not expect to know the Bible and people you expect would know the Bible. And he puts in what I see as references to a number of Old Testament stories. So a man had 2 sons. The man who has 2 and only 2 sons in the Bible is, of course, Isaac. And that's triggered there. And what we find is, of course, the story of Isaac is the story of how Jacob, the younger son, cheated the elder out of his inheritance. Therefore, the elder brother is very angry. The younger brother has to go away into a far country. Of course, there are contrasts, because in Jacob's case, he goes off with nothing and he comes back with an awful lot. And we often find in Jesus' stories, it uses parts of Old Testament stories, but actually reverses them as well. Then we see with Jacob and Esau that Esau is associated with the field. Jacob is a man who dwells in tents. Esau is there out in the field and he's hunting. And he comes back one time from hunting and says, "Here I am about to die. Of what use is the birthright to me?" Now notice that phrase, "Here I am dying of hunger," who else in the Bible says, "Here I am dying of hunger"? That's the younger brother says it in Jesus' story. So what the older brother says in the Old Testament just before he loses his birthright is what Jesus reuses for the younger brother. But the most striking connection between the stories is the fact that if you're a scribe and you count phrases, you know there's only one time in the Old Testament where someone runs, embraces, and kisses someone. And that is when Esau runs, embraces, and kisses Jacob, returning from a far country. And that is the most surprising narrative reaction in the Old Testament. There is nothing at all to prepare you for that. You know that Esau is coming to, has been angry, wants to kill his brother, is coming towards him with 400 armed men, and that Jacob is so scared that it gives you most of a chapter, him dividing his family into different portions and so on. That's what's going on. So the surprise then, when Esau runs, embraces, and kisses Jacob is amazing. But this is Esau, who was cheated out of everything, is embracing and forgiving his younger brother. Now we know that scribes at the time of Jesus actually had a special training when it came to this verse, Genesis 33 verse 4. It's one of the 15 verses in the Old Testament and one of the 5 verses in the book of Genesis that they had particularly to know scribal systems for. And what we have here on the screen, I'll just show you, is 6 dots here. Can you see that word? Or in this different manuscript, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dots, which you have to put over a word because of a debate between scribes about whether Esau could actually have kissed Jacob. And so this was part of the training that I think we can show goes back to the time of Jesus. Now, just to give you some technical stuff, these are manuscripts from about 900 years after Jesus, right? 900 to 1,000 years. These dots, however, seem to be there earlier because you have earlier Jewish writers talking about them, and I'll have a big long footnote in the forthcoming book explaining why I think we can show that most probably this goes back to the time of Jesus. What that means is that Jesus has made to coincide the high, dramatic high point of his story, the bit we would have the music go highest on in a film, where the father runs, embraces and kisses the son, he's made that to coincide with part of the scribal training, so that it's something particularly poignant to them, that they should be reminded of this. Well, if Esau can forgive his brother Jacob, who, even though Esau's a bad guy, and even though Jacob cheated him out of everything, why is it that the Pharisees and the scribes have a problem with the tax collectors who've cheated them coming to God? You see, it's a very, very powerful rhetorical point. There are lots of softer connections as you look across this. The young goats, interesting, the only time you get young goats eaten or talked about being eaten is when Jacob is tricking his father up close, his father, by the way, who cannot see in the distance. He's tricking his father, wearing his older brother's robes, not clothes, robes, right? And that's when he's serving him young goat. And so when in Jesus' story it says, bring the best robe for the younger brother, you have to ask, whose is the best robe? Well, it either has to be the father's robe or the older brother's robe. There's no other possibility. So it's quite striking that we have these sorts of connections. Even the language of how the older brother is drawing near, it says the older brother drew near to the farm, and that's when he gets really angry. Draw near if you're a scribe, because 6 times in the passage where Jacob is cheating his father, as a scribe, you notice how many times words occur. It really is, if you've ever copied something out, it is much more in your mind than if you simply read. So this is the sort of thing that would be triggered. Okay, so we got lots and lots of those sorts of references. But also we can say that Esau was waiting at home for his father to die. He says, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother Jacob. And then later we see that he forgave his brother who cheated him out of everything. There are some echoes also, I believe, of the story of Jacob and Laban. Here are some of them, and I want to highlight the one that's, I think, most striking, which are when the older brother says, I have been working for you for all of these years, and he's saying it to a father figure, okay, to his father. That is exactly what Jacob says to his father-in-law when he's run away from him. There are other connections. For instance, the older brother talking about this son of yours. Oh, that's a powerful phrase, isn't it? This son of yours. He's denying brotherhood. This son of yours, who has devoured, eaten your property. That phrase, eaten property, of course, comes specifically from what Laban's daughters say their father has done. You get some lovely contrast. The father saying in Jesus' story, all that I have is yours. All that's mine is yours. Literally and legally true. But of course, there's Laban's claim, well, everything you see, he says to Jacob, is mine, which is not true. There's a little bit more, which is, I think, we have the story of Joseph here. And it's particularly striking that you get in Jesus' story, sudden ring and robe. There's only one place that you get sudden ring and robe, and they're left on in the Bible. Now, you may well think also of the book of Esther. I think the book of Esther is slightly echoed in this book with Mordecai. It's more complex. But yes, I'm not just saying Jesus is only echoing Genesis in this story. There's more. But I just want to focus on Genesis for now, because it's quite enough to fit all of this into a 3-minute story. And what we find is that just as Joseph comes out of prison, and it's the only Old Testament instant rags to riches story where it then is a lasting position, that's what Jesus picks up in his story. And of course, in Jesus' story, he's used the phrase great famine. Some people argue that a famine is for a season and a great famine is a multi-year famine. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's plausible. So when you have in Jesus' story, there was a great famine in that land, and you look through the Old Testament, where does the phrase great famine occur? The place where it's most associated with is the story of Joseph. And of course, Joseph has this wonderful contrast with the prodigal. No one gives the prodigal any food, but Joseph is the one who fed everyone, including his brothers. Joseph went to a far country, and he's the son that his father thought was dead, but then turned out to be alive again. So you can see how Jesus is using bits of these stories in his 3-minute story. And there's a lesson in that. Joseph forgave his brothers, the older brother doesn't. Now, there is in the Joseph story this, what seems like a digression in Genesis chapter 38, a very important, although difficult passage, where you have the story of Judah impregnating his daughter-in-law Tamar, from which the messianic line to David and Jesus comes. Okay? Whoa. But when the older brother says, you never gave me a young goat that I could celebrate with my friends, but when this son of yours, who has eaten up your property with prostitutes came, you killed for him the fatted calf. There's only one place in the Bible where you get young goat, friend, and prostitute together. So just as you see, these are really close together in the text, these are really close together in the Old Testament text. That's all within 2 verses. It's famous. You remember what happened? Judah, from whom the Jews are named, was in the land sexually misbehaving, while his brother Joseph was in a foreign land resisting Mrs. Potiphar. Right? So it's a very powerful thing. How does the older brother know what his younger brother has been doing? He's just come in from the field. He hasn't spoken to anyone. And the older brother's just back. The younger brother is just back. He's not been sending postcards from the brothel. So there's only one source of information: imagination. That's the only possible source of information. So what we're doing, and this is the amazing part of the story, is the storyteller is hinting at the mind of the older brother. You see where he would like to be. And so you have this very, very powerful element to the story. But it's also the story of Abraham. You see, when it says a man had 2 sons, that does remind you of Abraham. And Abraham is the archetypal father. Just as we have the father in this story, we have Abraham is even the AB of his name. Ab means father. And in the next chapter, Jesus is going to tell the story of the temporarily rich man and Lazarus. And the temporarily rich man, who of course is no longer rich after he goes to Hades, he keeps on calling out to Abraham, Father Abraham. He does it 3 times. Of course, if Abraham was his father, that would imply Lazarus was his brother, because Abraham has multiple descendants. But anyway, what we see is Abraham begins his speech in Genesis chapter 18 with the word quick. That is what the father begins his speech with in Luke 15. The first word from the father's mouth is not to the younger son. It's to the servants. Quick, go and get the fatted calf. If you're a scribe, you might well remember the first person to say quick in the Bible, the first time you copy the word quick. In fact, it goes like this: quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, needed to make cakes, he says to Sarah, and Abraham ran and took to the herd and took a calf tender and good. So it's quick, leading to a calf, which is exactly what happens in Jesus' story. Quick, get the fatted calf ready. But what we notice is, it's the first time someone runs in the Bible, Genesis 18, the first hospitality in the Bible. I'm excluding Melchizedek. He's a sort of, not takeaway service, but, Deliveroo service. And I don't include the meal in Genesis 3, okay? Not really a meal, snack. Not really worth it. The first hospitality in the Bible is Genesis 18. First time someone says, quick, the first fatted calf. If you're a scribe, all of those things are just hitting together in Jesus' story. He's the only other old person in the Bible to run, begins his speech with quick, leads to a fatted calf. And then we also know that Jesus was thinking about 3 seahs or 3 measures, because Jesus' shortest parable is this: the kingdom of heaven is like a leaven or yeast that a woman took and hid in 3 seahs or measures of flour till it was all leavened. This is an absolutely amazing story. It's Jesus' shortest parable, and it says so much. Who is the woman in the Bible who's mentioned with 3 seahs of flour? Well, it's Sarah. Sarah and Abraham entertained 3 guests, one of whom turned out to be God. They did a really good job of the entertainment. They killed an animal which would feed 400 or 500 people for 3 guests. They ran, they worked, they were really good hosts. And God is never in debt to anyone. So he says to Abraham, okay, you're in charge of the heavenly feast. Right? That's the way it works out. Now think about Sarah's investment. How much investment has come from that bit of baking that she did? From that baking has come the whole of God's enterprise afterwards. Right? Everything that's happening, our redemption, is all tied up with that. And it's just growing and growing and growing. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. This woman, and Sarah, she wasn't exactly perfect. Neither was Abraham. Okay? She's laughing at the time, thinking, yeah, all this stuff. But that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. Isn't that an encouraging thing when we think about our sin, our weak efforts, and just a bit of baking, and whoa, that is such a powerful story to tell. So the power of a longer story, like a 3-minute story, the power of a 10-second story, actually it's 5, isn't it, really? Okay, now in Jesus' story, the inheritance is shared between the brothers, but of course in Abraham's story, the younger son inherits everything. But Abraham is the only person in the Bible, other person, to give away his inheritance while he's still alive. That's very clear what it says in Genesis 25. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So there's a big contrast there. And why? Why is it that only Isaac inherits? There was actually a possibility that Isaac and Ishmael would both inherit, but what we find is Ishmael lost his inheritance. Look at how it says in Luke 15, the older brother was angry and refused to go in. Abraham held a feast for his younger son, for Isaac, and it says this in Genesis 21. Isaac, the child, grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Ishmael lost inheritance by laughing at the feast for the younger brother. If you, as an older brother, a scribe, a Pharisee, who think that you're fine, are not prepared for the younger brothers, the tax collectors and the sinners, to come to God, you lose your inheritance. It's a very, very powerful but subtle implication. It's there, as Jesus says often in his stories, let the one who has ears to hear, hear. It's not there if you aren't listening particularly carefully. Of course, Abraham didn't allow his son Isaac to go into a far country. He made sure his servant did that. I think it's also the story of Cain and Abel. First person to point this out was for me, was when I was reading Tim Keller's book, The Prodigal God. What a good book, and what a great and godly example Tim Keller has been to us, and how inspiring his life has been, and we thank God for him. But, he just says, you can see it's there. It's the Bible's first brothers. A man had 2 sons. Yeah, that will be Adam had 2 sons. Cain and Abel. It's the first family conflict. One brother connected with the field, one brother associated with caring for animals, and the older brother gets very angry that the younger brother is accepted by the father figure, by God. The Bible's first recorded anger is envy of an older brother to a younger brother after the younger brother has been accepted. How can you not see that that's connected with Jesus' story? And then God graciously engages with the older brother with Cain, and then we're not really told about Cain saying anything back to God. It's exactly the same structure as you get in Jesus' story, where the father pleads with the older brother, and so on. So all of these things, there is some connection. Maybe I'm inventing them, maybe they're not there, but there are some things that are fairly clear. I think Joseph with the ring and the robes, Esau running, embracing and kissing, Jacob, I've worked for you all these years, Abraham, who's 99 years old, don't you think scribes noticed that? An old man running, saying quick and getting the fatted calf. And there are dozens of others throughout Genesis. So it seems, therefore, that Jesus is telling a coherent story that's a simple story that will work if you don't know anything about the Bible. If you're just a sinner, interested in sin, well, it tells you can come back to the Father God and he'll accept you and forgive you. If you're a scribe, then it also challenges you at lots of deeper levels, because there are all of these people who have reasons for anger. Esau lost his inheritance, Laban lost his property, Joseph was sold by his brothers, Ishmael his inheritance. And what happens? Well, we find that there are lessons for these scribes. Joseph forgave his brothers. In fact, he even preserved their inheritance. Esau forgave his brother. Laban was told by God, you've got to accept it and make peace. And Ishmael lost his inheritance through mocking his younger brother. So there's a huge number of lessons. The lessons of Abraham welcoming complete strangers really, really well. So all of these things are very striking. And so I'd conclude from this that there's a unified, simple story by someone who knows the Old Testament really well, really well. They've thought about it very deeply. And you don't get this sort of story made by a committee. You don't get this sort of story made by an evolving storytelling where people add bits, as one person adds a bit more. It just doesn't work. To have the consistency of theme based around Genesis, you really need one mind at the beginning. So then the question is the mind the gospel writer Luke, or is the mind of Jesus? And there, I'm going to make the case in the book, it really is far simpler to say it's Jesus. Just to give you a few reasons for that. Well, firstly, you've got to explain clever things in the other gospels too, right? So it's simpler to have Jesus as the genius. You then have particular patterns of speech that are associated with Jesus. You look at the patterns, you analyze some of them, and it makes more sense if the thing comes from Jesus and not from Luke. And this is the amazing thing. It's almost as if Genesis is designed to make the building blocks for this story. I'm not saying Genesis is only designed for that. But there is something that, if in the beginning was the Word, Jesus is the Word incarnate, yes, that makes it possible for this long book, Genesis, to be so designed as to give you all the key bits to fit into this beautiful story. Now, I want to look briefly at some other aspects of Jesus' cleverness, and one of them is about the question of the language Jesus spoke. I want to look at the Lesson on the Mount. That's Matthew 5 through to 7, often called the Sermon on the Mount. The problem with that phrase is it makes it sound like it was delivered in one go as a speech, whereas it explicitly says that Jesus went up on the mountain and he taught them. That means you don't need to memorize the Beatitudes in one go. He taught them the Beatitudes. You see the difference? So people often have this worry. How do we have Jesus' words handed down to us? Well, one of the things is he repeated them, and he was the best ever teacher. He had memory techniques to help us, help people hear, and so on. So when you look at the Lesson on the Mount, ask the question, what language was it spoken in? Well, in Mark, we often see Jesus using Aramaic. So he says to a 12-year-old girl, Talitha kum, girl, get up, or to a deaf-mute man, Ephatha. I shouldn't think that deaf-mute man was well-educated. So he speaks Aramaic to them. That isn't evidence that he gave public educational speeches in Aramaic. Okay? The fact that he speaks Aramaic, for instance, praying to his father, Abba, or speaking from the cross and is then misunderstood as calling for Elijah, doesn't mean that he did public teaching in Aramaic. He may have done. But certainly what happened in the 16th century is people emphasized Aramaic as the language Jesus spoke. And by the Romantic movement, it became important that Jesus only spoke Aramaic. Now, why was that important? That was important for people to be able to establish Jesus as the uncorrupted primitive human who could express our connection with God as a poet, the archetypal poet who could then do that. And it's really important then that he doesn't know about those nasty people, Plato and Aristotle and so on, right? So that's where this sort of blame the Greeks idea that I'm afraid is far too common. This idea that Christianity was all okay, and then these Greek ideas came and infected everything. It's not that there aren't some Greek infections, but it's a simplification to say that that's what's gone wrong. And then today, of course, skeptics like Bart Ehrman like to emphasize Jesus as only speaking Aramaic. They emphasize him, even explicitly call him a peasant, which is a very interesting thing. Now, I would say the fact that the Gospels are in Greek shows you early Christians valued Greek. And of course, the Holy Family went down to Egypt for a while. If they were in Egypt having to trade, as let's say Joseph trading as a carpenter, even for a few months, he would be using Greek. Jesus was an itinerant preacher. Usually itinerant preachers have to adapt the way they speak to different places. 2 of Jesus' 12 disciples have Greek names, Andrew and Philip. Andrew is interesting because his parents, you've got Simon and Andrew. They call their younger son Andreas, which is a relatively rare Greek name. They call Simon a name which will work in Greek and in Hebrew. And yet Simon is the son of John or Jonas, which is a Semitic name. But they are connected with Bethsaida. They're near the Sea of Galilee. They're near a border where people are speaking Greek on the other side, Aramaic more on the other side. So a lot of evidence that perhaps that family would have been multilingual. And of course, Jesus engages with many people who speak different languages. Nicodemus, wonderful Greek name there, isn't it? And Timaeus, I love Bartimaeus. You see, Bartimaeus is a beggar, so he's not high up socially. And he's Bartimaeus because B-A-R is the Aramaic word for son. So his father was called Timaeus, which means maybe his grandparents liked Plato, right? Because Plato made a dialogue called Timaeus, and they said, or maybe they just like the name. But, it's an amazing sequence that you have there. The top Jewish body is called the Sanhedrin, which is a Greek word, Sanhedrion, the people who sit together. Now, there is so much Greek being used amongst the Jews, even those who use Hebrew or Aramaic, because if you want to get on socially, this is the language to use. We have this situation where at the moment, English has imperial status as the language that, if we have a mixture of people, let's say English and Germans get together, then they will probably be speaking English together. It's very unlikely they'll be speaking German together. And this is the way it happens. Now, if you've got Aramaic speakers and Greek speakers together, which are they going to have to do? Greek's the language of the Eastern Roman Empire. They're going to be using Greek. So that's where you can see this idea that Jesus doesn't have contact with Greek, can't teach Greek, is a bit of a problem. In fact, Jesus used specific Greek words, like the word hypocrite. Hypocrite means actor. Now remember, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, which is less than 4 miles away from a theatre. Now, this is clearly a Greek word. And the thing about theatre is theatre began with the Greeks and then the Romans copied it. The Hebrews don't have theatre, and the Aramaic culture doesn't have theatre. So the very fact that Jesus is calling people, Pharisees, theatre actors is an appeal clearly to part of Greek culture. You don't have native words in Hebrew and Aramaic for actor because they don't have acting. Jesus 3 times talks about Hades. That's a clearly Greek thing. Yes, he talked about Gehenna as well. He would talk about both. He would exegete the analogies between the cultures, if you like, in explaining these things. He would talk in John's Gospel about the Paraclete, clearly Greek word, of the Holy Spirit coming. In fact, there's one time in John's Gospel where they say, look, is he going to go and try and get another career teaching Greeks? Well, that wouldn't have worked if he didn't know any Greek. Clearly, he was able to get a career teaching Greeks. He just chose not to. Now, when you get the Lesson on the Mount, it's interesting when you look at the crowds, because where are the crowds from? Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, and Judea. Well, these guys from the Decapolis, the 10 cities, the 10 Greek cities, don't expect them to understand Jesus if he's speaking Galilean Aramaic. If this is the crowd, I'm sorry, the language they're going to be speaking together or is going to be Greek, or there's going to be a translation facility in addition to Greek. There are all sorts of possibilities. Jesus may have taught in both languages. That's possible as well. Now, when we see it begin, we see that he taught them. Then we see that we have alliteration. This is the Beatitudes in Greek, Matthew 5, 3 through to 10. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So there's verse 3, is blessed are the poor in spirit. The first highlighted letter is the letter pi, as you know, 3.14, etc. Is the letter pi for the word poor, the word spirit, pneuma, also with pi. Then we have those who mourn, in verse 4, with pi, but then we comforted with the letter pi. Then verse 5, those who are meek, with pi. And then verse 6, those who hunger with pi. Then you look at verse 6 again. They hunger and thirst for righteousness. The word thirst is in yellow, delta iota, di, righteousness, delta iota. Go to verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart. Pure, like cathartic, cleansing, is kappa alpha. Heart, cardiology, is kappa alpha. You see, you get Ka, Ka as alliteration to help you remember. The last one, verse 10, those who are persecuted for righteousness, and I hope you can see quite a bit of a D there, and a Di for in the root of persecute and the word righteousness. There's a bit more because in verse 7, blessed are the merciful, they will obtain mercy. You just have repeated letters in blue, or cyan. Some people call this colour cyan, don't they? Then we have the word, verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Now, they don't look like the same letters, but in first century Greek, they sounded the same. That means all 8 of these have sound connection across. They are highly, highly memorable. Then we find that the clauses are joined by, in the first and last cases, by saying, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the ones in between are saying, because they. If you try and say any of those in Hebrew or in Aramaic, you will not get a smooth join between the phrases. It's about how people do relative clauses. I can explain it if you like. But this works really well in Greek. And in Greek, you can see how all of these end with the same 5 letters. In fact, some of them end with the same 8 letters. Okay? That sort of stuff. And then there are even, where I've got my dark blues, all my plurals ending in S are together. The plurals ending in OI are together. So I've talked about hypocrites and so on. This is a nice one. That's in the Sermon on the Mount, of course. He talks about hypocrites all the time. He's actors, 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 right? Then he says, you get towards the end of the lesson, beware, P-R-O, of false prophets, P-R-O, because they come to you in the sheep of clothing of sheep, P-R-O. You see the memory techniques here. Now you could say this is just Matthew, but that won't explain why the same happens in Mark. I'm going to make you fishers of men, alpha, alpha. It's not the well who need a doctor, iota, iota. It's not, can the sons of the bride chamber, nu, that looks like a V, but it's an N, fast, nu, while the bridegroom, nu, is with them. With what measure you use, it will be measured to you. The word measure is M-E-T-R, begins M-E-T-R. I don't say it's M-E-T-P, but this is an R, okay, believe me. It's like our word meter, okay? What measure you use will be measured to you. Now, I want you to notice 3 words in a row begin with that. Does that work in your language? No. Doesn't work in English, does it? They're not 3 in a row. We could divide them up. It works in Greek. So, alliteration in Mark. The Son of Man has to suffer, be rejected, alpha, beginning with alpha, and be killed, beginning with alpha, and he'll rise again, beginning with alpha, and all of them end with the same 4 letters. Okay? if anyone wants to follow me, beginning with alpha, he's got to deny himself, beginning with alpha, take up his cross, beginning with alpha, and follow me, alpha. You get the idea? What does it profit someone to gain the whole world, kappa? Kappa. Well, what can a man, beginning with alpha, give in return for his soul? And you see how this is happening again and again. So Jesus taught memorably, often to crowds, and I think there's no need, therefore, to think there's a big gap between his words and what we have in the Gospels. If you want to read more about that, why not subscribe to the amazing free magazine from Tyndale House, tyndalehouse.com/magazine, and I've got an article on that.